The Sustainability Now Telesummit is honored to share audacious ideas and innovative solutions from more than 30 experts from around the globe. Learn how we can work together to shape a world that works. Here's your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome back to the Sustainability Now Telesummit, Shaping a World That Works. I am so delighted to welcome Michael Palwin. He's a pioneer in regenerative design, and his firm Exploration Architecture focuses on high-performance buildings and solutions for the circular economy. Company projects have included a groundbreaking office project, an ultra-low energy data center, a zero-waste textiles factory, and progressive solutions for green cities. For 10 years prior to setting up Exploration, Michael worked with a firm called Grimshaw, where he was central to designing the Eden Project, which you absolutely have to check out. It's phenomenal. He's regularly booked as a keynote speaker on innovation, and his TED Talk has had over 1.8 million viewings. His best-selling book, Biomimicry and Architecture, has a second edition that was published in October of 2016. Michael jointly initiated the widely acclaimed Sahara Forest Project, the latest version of which was opened by the King of Jordan in 2017. Michael, welcome. It's a privilege and pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for involving me.
Absolutely. Well, your work is so extraordinary. You are integrating so many different elements, and it kind of creates a new language. So I want to add some vocabulary words that we can just sort of discuss so that people have a sense of where we're headed. We're talking about regenerative architecture, we're talking and design and sustainable design, biomimicry, biophilia, and I'm hoping you can just sort of give us a baseline to jump off from with those definitions.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So I would guess that most people are pretty familiar with the idea of sustainable design. So trying to design in a way that meets our current needs without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. So that was known as the Brundtland definition of sustainability. But what we've seen more and more is that too much sustainability has really just been about mitigating negatives, trying to make things less bad. And I think now there's a really urgent need to move beyond that to a regenerative paradigm. So rather than simply mitigating negatives, what we need to do is find ways of creating buildings and cities that actually deliver net positives, that restore ecosystems, that are actively better for the people that use those buildings and those cities. And then within regenerative design, there are a couple of really important biologically inspired design approaches. In fact, I would argue that the whole discipline of regenerative design is rooted in biology and involves rethinking our place on Earth, actually, and our role as humans in stewarding the way we live with those living systems. So the two main disciplines that I want to talk about within that are biomimicry and biophilia. Biomimicry is essentially a functional discipline. It involves looking at how functions are delivered in biology and then learning from that to develop design solutions that suit human needs. So a really simple example that everyone has heard about is Velcro. That was actually inspired by a seed burr that had stuck to a dog's fur, and George de Mistral, he was the dog's owner, he was an engineer, he took that seed burr home and looked at it under a magnifying glass and saw that it had all these little sort of hook structures on it, and that's what gave him the idea for Velcro. Now, since then, biomimicry as a discipline has moved on enormously. With advances in scientific knowledge, we know more and more about some of the amazing adaptations that exist in biology. The other one, biophilia, that is based on mainly the work of a famous biologist, E.O. Wilson. So he wrote a book called the Biophilia Hypothesis. And his argument was that because humans had evolved in direct contact with nature, there was a lot of evidence to suggest that we are happier, healthier, and more productive when we're in regular contact with nature. And that's now turned into a whole sort of discipline of design, designing buildings in a way that it connects with nature outside, as well as integrating nature and natural analogs into the building itself. And those two disciplines of biomimicry and biophilia, they can coexist very happily within the same building, so they're not mutually exclusive.
Wonderful. So let's just back up to the notion of regenerative design. And you're talking about enhancing the environment. And how does that translate in a practical way?
Okay, let's take a number of examples of different scales. So let's say that you were designing a new piece of city. The most persuasive argument I've heard for how to go about that comes from a group of consultants called Biomimicry 3.8 in the US, who I've had the pleasure of working with. And what they say is that the conventional sustainable design systems like LEED and BRIAM, those don't go anywhere near far enough. And what we should really do when we're designing a new piece of city is we should start by looking at how a pristine ecosystem in that part of the world functions, or would have functioned if it doesn't exist anymore. You know, how much oxygen does it produce? How much water does it filter? How much carbon does it sequester? How much biodiversity does it accommodate? How much food does it produce? And then we should set those as the targets for our new piece of city. And when we get to that point, we're nowhere near that at the moment, but when we get to that point, then we could safely say that we have fully integrated that new piece of city into a broader, stable living system. A good example of a regenerative building, one that I often use, is a hospital that's in Singapore. It's called the KTP Hospital. And that was designed principally using biophilia. So based on some earlier academic studies of a hospital in, I think it was in Philadelphia, they found that people with a view of nature would, from the window next to their hospital bed, those people would recover 8% more quickly than the people on the other side of the same ward that had a view over the road to a brick wall. They would recover 8% more quickly, and they would need half the amount of pain-relieving drugs.
Wow.
That's huge in terms of the human benefits, but also in terms of the economic benefits. If you think of the advantage of treating everyone and getting them to recover 8% more quickly, then that hospital could treat 8% more patients over the course of a year. And for this one in Singapore, the KTP hospital, they really went to town with the biophilia. It's full of plants, it's got the most beautiful planted atrium, and it's become a haven for birds and insects. And the anecdotal evidence, they haven't done detailed studies yet, but the anecdotal evidence suggests that it's delivering really significant improvements in well-being. And my feeling is that's the way we should be designing all hospitals and actually applying a lot of those principles to other buildings as well, to workplaces, to schools, so we improve people's learning outcomes. And so that I think is the clearest way of describing what a regenerative building means.
You know, in your conversation, I just have to ask you, you said it's in a hospital and you said insects. And insects in hospitals, it just sort of goes against the whole notion of at least American hospitals, which are meant to be sterile. And how does that work?
Yeah, sure. All right. Well, I should be clear. Those insects stay outside.
Okay.
Not in the building. There are lots of walkways and garden areas where people can get out and sit and just enjoy nature as part of their recovery process.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you picked that one up.
Okay. So that's it. That sounds like a phenomenal example, and the statistics that you're quoting are quite substantial. I mean, to be able to have documentation that nature makes a difference. I've heard of that in urban areas too, where having trees is is a really crucial element in social well-being.
Yeah, and reducing crime, amazingly.
Right, because people feel connected to their environment more.
Yeah.
Right? So, okay, so regenerative architecture, and tell us more about biomimicry and the intention of integrating that in design and in function. It's really on both levels that it's so critical, right?
Yeah. So biomimicry for me is just a wonderfully fresh lens with which to look at familiar problems. And because it draws on such a rich source book of solutions, it often produces really quite startling breakthroughs. And perhaps the best example I can give is a project that my company's worked on. So this is the biomimetic office. There's an image of that, which is the model. What we did here was that we had a fantastic client, and he had already designed a very low energy office building, and he wanted to go even further. And he was pretty fascinated by the potential of biomimicry. And we got together a really awesome team of some of the best consultants that I've got to know over the last few years. And we insisted on having a biologist as part of that team. And in the first workshop, we divided up the challenge of office design into the separate functions. And then, when I say functions, I mean things like the structure, the ventilation, the sun shading, how you bring light in, how you protect from fire, that kind of thing. And then working with the biologist, we looked at how those kind of functions had already been delivered in biology. And we agreed in that first workshop that the thing that was most likely to drive the strategic form of the building was daylight. We wanted to make this building as far as possible naturally lit. And that was partly for reasons of human health, and also because it would save a lot of energy. So we looked at examples of how light is gathered and distributed in biology. And we looked at some pretty remarkable examples, like there was one called a spookfish. And now the spookfish has what are called diverticular eyes. So part of the eye points upwards to the light coming from the ocean surface, and then part of the eye points downwards. And that part that's pointing downwards, that's picking up very low levels of bioluminescence coming up from the ocean. And it has evolved mirrors in its eyes, which can focus that very low level of light onto the retina. And that gave us, just in a very straightforward way, that gave us the idea of creating a large-scale mirror in the atrium that would bounce light into the lower floors. So that form that you can see in the kind of lower foreground there, that was a meeting room underneath these large-scale reflective surfaces. And that was, the idea there was that it would help to bounce light into the lower floors. We found it was reasonably easy to get enough light into the upper floors. The challenge was how to get enough light into those lower floors. And then another idea we got from biology about light was from a rainforest plant called Anthurium werequinum. So that is a rainforest plant that lives in very low light levels in the forest floor. And it's got lenses all over its leaves. And somehow those appear to be able to focus diffuse light, which is pretty amazing. And the idea that we explored was whether we could focus light off from the roof into fiber optic tubes, which we could then conduct around the building. That proved to be quite complicated, so that's something that we're still researching and we're hoping to bring in to the next stage of the project. But I think it's a good example. Well, those two examples, the spookfish and that rainforest plant, those are good examples of the sort of breadth and depth of biomimicry. So sometimes it can be quite obvious and actually quite straightforward how you apply ideas from biology. So in the case of the spookfish, it was just a simple idea of using a mirror to bounce light into the place you wanted it. With the rainforest plant, the Anthurium werequinum, that's much more complicated to try and mimic that. And we need to get together some scientific experts on that particular plant, together with some optics experts and some manufacturing and materials experts, to actually turn that into a viable product. And biomimicry can be anything between straightforward to being a really complicated, detailed application of scientific principles. The key thing, from my perspective, is that it's a way of delivering a higher performance building. So a building that is better for people, it uses less energy and less resources, and so on. Now, you might just be able to make out, if you look along the right-hand side, that glazing, each unit is slightly curved.
Yes.
And what we're doing there, that was an idea learned from shells and leaf forms, which is that if you've got a thin surface and you put a slight curve to it, then you make it much stiffer. And then if you put two of those back to back, you make something that is strong enough to span from floor to floor. And by doing that, we estimate we can achieve nearly a 50% saving in glass and about a 75% saving in aluminium. So that's the kind of breakthrough that biomimicry can deliver. And on this building, we looked at nearly 100 different biological organisms in the process. And some of them we were able to rule out quite quickly. Others sort of stayed with us all the way through. And I guess in a way, that design process is a little bit like an evolutionary process. So we start off by identifying lots of possibilities, and then working with the team, we focus down on the most viable ones that help us address the key design challenges.
I'm just thinking that it's a monumental sleuthing expedition to find these biological models for problems that you're facing. I mean, first you have to define the problem, and probably in a novel way. You probably have to look at the problem from a whole different vantage point, and then try and find biological solutions. How do you go about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right, that defining the problem carefully and precisely is a really important part of the process. It's much easier now to apply biomimicry than it used to be, because there are better resources online. And there is one called asknature.org, which allows you to type in a question for the design challenge you're trying to solve, and then it'll produce a list of results for good biological examples that you can look at. We always try to involve a biologist in the design process so that he or she can sit with us and help identify some of the most promising sort of avenues. And then often we'll need to go a step further and find out who the kind of world authority on that particular biological organism is, and then sometimes engage with them in order to get a more detailed understanding. So yes, it's not exactly straightforward, but equally it's not necessarily rocket science either. My understanding of biology doesn't go much beyond school biology. I did biology A-level, but I didn't study it any further than age 18. And that's enough to be able to know how to ask the right questions and to at least understand the sort of responses that come back. But as an architect, you don't have to have a detailed knowledge of all the subjects that you kind of interface with. You just need to know how to ask the right questions and how to integrate the results.
I'm wondering about the evolution of materials that you're using. And how that's changing, particularly with the concentration or an interest in circular economy and cradle-to-cradle kind of materials approach. How do you address that?
Yeah, so there's a very interesting overlap between the circular economy and biomimicry. And I think a really big part of getting to the circular economy, getting to a point where we are properly stewarding all materials in closed loop cycles, I think a lot of the solutions we need are going to be found in biology, because that is the basis of biology. All the resources that flow through ecosystems are managed in a way that is non-toxic and zero waste. And so there's a lot that we can learn at a materials level, as well as at a kind of the level of flows of resources. So what I mean by that is, at a materials level, we're going to have to rethink the way we put things together. And in biology, materials and structures are assembled using very low energy bonds and low energy manufacturing, which then makes it much easier to disassemble those, break them down into their constituent components. And then in terms of how those flow around systems, there's a lot that we can learn from the characteristics of real ecosystems. And it's worth contrasting conventional human-made systems with ecosystems. So our conventional systems, they tend to be quite simple, disconnected, linear, wasteful, often using toxic materials, generally with extractive sources of materials. And ecosystems are the exact opposite. They are complex, interconnected, they're zero waste. Toxins are only used for very specific short-term purposes. It all runs entirely on solar energy, and those ecosystems are regenerative rather than extractive. And so that is a really good model for where we need to be heading in rethinking our industries and our economies. And I think the circular economy has a lot to learn from biomimicry, or to put it in a more positive way, biomimicry can contribute a lot to the idea of a circular economy.
I agree.
Even to the idea of sort of rethinking our growth mindset. Conventional economists are fixated on endless growth, but we know that we've got to change that, because even a modest growth rate of 3%, that would mean a doubling of the world economy every 24 years. And yet we're already really struggling with resource limits and planetary boundaries. So we just can't carry on growing like that. And then, there are some people that advocate negative growth, actually shrinking. I think that's going to be a tough one. In some ways we need to, but for me, the most positive way of framing this is to create a system based on dynamic equilibrium with high levels of growth, decay, and renewal, all in a state of balance. And that's exactly how biology works.
That's a good point. I think you've touched on so many different things, really, in terms of economics. The biomimicries being applied in economic systems or redesign of systems. And we have to, because as you said, the continued growth isn't sustainable. Let's talk about biomimicry in existing buildings and also in maybe potentially more conventional designs. How can that be applied? And same thing with regenerative design.
Yeah. Okay. With existing buildings, I think a good way to start is to start by identifying what is worth hanging on to. In any existing building, there are going to be some things that are actually very useful or beautiful or meaningful, and that they're worth hanging on to. There may be some things that are very difficult to change, and it's worth using your imagination and creativity to find ways to reuse those. And then there'll be other things that are fairly easy to change and maybe even need to change because they're performing very poorly. So in this country, in the UK, we have a lot of really poorly performing buildings. They're very drafty, they're poorly insulated, and we need to actually upgrade those pretty quickly. And that in many cases, that will mean that we would hang on to the primary structure, but we might well fundamentally change the external walls, or possibly only the windows. And even if it is only the windows, you could still apply biomimicry to design the best possible windows that keep in the heat, that let in exactly the right amount of light, that convert all surplus light into electricity, that kind of thing. So it's really just a matter of identifying where the design challenges are. And biomimicry is, I would argue, is equally applicable to existing buildings as to new buildings. I quite like working on new buildings because it gives you a chance to rethink things from first principles. But I fully recognize that we need to do far more in the way of renovating existing buildings than building new ones. The other part of your question, Mira, was?
With conventional buildings. And,
oh, yes. Yeah. When I was first starting to apply biomimicry, people would often say, I can see how you would apply biomimicry to an unusual building like the Eden Project, but what about a more normal building, like, say, a factory or an office or whatever? And we've talked about the office building. We could also talk about a factory that we worked on. So we were contacted by a client in India who runs a textile company, and he asked us to design what he described as something that had to be a new paradigm for industrial buildings in India. And he wanted it to be a fantastic place for people to work in terms of the working environment. He wanted it to be zero carbon, and he wanted it to be zero waste and as close as possible to closed loop on water. And those are pretty big challenges because the textile industry is a huge consumer of energy and water and also a big polluter.
Yes, huge.
So we put together a team that was specific to the challenge, and we had a biologist, a green chemist, and a water expert, in addition to the normal team members of a structural engineer and an environmental engineer and a cost consultant. And working with the client, we looked at all the inputs that were proving problematic, and we looked at new ways of approaching the color dyeing process and the bleaching process and so on, and found that there were pretty good alternatives to all of those. And by designing the toxins out of the system, we were then able to use biological forms of treatment for the water and make huge savings in the amount of water. And a lot of that treatment uses plants and microorganisms to treat the wastewater. And so that we could get secondary benefits from that, we literally put the water treatment right down the middle of the project. So what we have there is 2 factory units, which are huge. They're about 1,000 feet long each. And those are orientated very precisely north-south so that we could get soft north light, soft daylight into the whole factory environment while keeping out sunlight, because sunlight would just give us problems with overheating. And then down the long edges of the building, there are large glazed openings so that people can look out onto nature from any part of that factory floor. And down the middle there, that green strip, that is actually the water treatment system. So that's using the plants and microorganisms to treat the water from the factory. Wow. And in the middle, that little oval-shaped building, that was the staff canteen, so that people from the factory can get a good break at least 3 times a day, and they can sit there and look out onto some nice plants and the water treatment system, which actually looks a bit like a bit of planting.
Is there a functional reason for the curved edges on the perimeter of the buildings?
That was mainly about just conducting the rainwater towards where we would have the downpipes. So it's slightly playful, but it does serve a functional purpose.
Wonderful. And how about this element over here on the far right?
Yeah, that was part of the biomass energy system. So prior to this, the client's energy system was based on coal. They had a small coal-fired power station, which is obviously very polluting. And we showed that by shifting to biomass, they could, assuming it was regrown at the rate at which it is harvested, that would deliver huge carbon savings. And then off-site, we also had large areas of solar. So on the roof, we would have solar on the south-facing parts of the roof, but because these textile factories are so energy intensive, even if we covered the whole roof with solar, that wouldn't be enough. So there would be some electricity that would come from the biomass power station, and then there would be some additional off-site solar as well.
That's extraordinary. How big a facility is this?
Well, those units are about 1,000 feet long by about 200 feet across, each one.
Wow. And how many people are employed there? Do you have any idea?
Not that many, actually, because it's a very highly mechanized process. Gosh, from memory, I think it was about 600 or so.
Wow. That's quite a transformation from a coal-based toxic business to something that is going zero waste and self-supporting.
Yeah.
That's extraordinary. Good for him to have that vision.
Absolutely, yeah.
We need more people doing that.
This is an example of an idea that we used in order to design an ultra-low energy data center.
Mm.
Now, the client for this one, he had negotiated to use the inside of a mountain in Norway. Now, this mountain had already been carved out for marble mining, and it had lots of disused tunnels in it that were all at a very low temperature of about 5 degrees centigrade. What that Fahrenheit? About 40 Fahrenheit, I think. So very, very cool. And that could be used as a free source of cooling to cool the data center. If you have a data center in a more normal location, say in a city or even a server in a building, then you're going to use a lot of energy just to keep that cool. And it makes much more sense to put it somewhere that's already cold and rely on high-speed data transmission to get the data to the clients. And the challenge for us in design terms was, how do we draw this free source of cold air through the data blocks, those are the individual components of the data center? How do we do that in the most efficient way? Now, this leaf shows what is referred to as Murray's law. Murray's law is a mathematical principle that appears to hold true for all branching systems in biology. And looking from the left to the right there, you can see that the diameter of those vessels steps down each time it branches. And that follows a very specific mathematical ratio. The cube of the parent, the cube of the cross-section of the parent vessel equals the sum of the cube of the two daughter vessels. And then there's also quite a constant angle of branching and a certain finessing to those junctions. So this appears to be an evolved minimum energy way of getting fluids and gases around an organism. And if we now turn to the next image, we can see so that was the data center that we designed. We arranged the data blocks in circular clusters, which would reduce the length of the pipework and reduce the number of bends. And then we designed that branching system based on Murray's law. That's quite a complicated branching system. We acknowledge that. And that means it would be more expensive in capital terms, but because of the substantial energy savings, that would pay for itself fairly quickly. And while that might look quite wacky and biological, it's not that way just because we're trying to look wacky and biological. It's that way because we've identified a theoretically perfect solution in biology, and now we're trying to get as close to that as we can in a design that suits human needs.
How large is this structure in the actual world?
Each of those blocks is about 2.5 meters high. So this, would you prefer if I quote in feet?
If you can, that would be great.
So those blocks are about 8 feet high by 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep.
Wow.
So that, I'm not sure what that would be. That's probably about 50 feet across the diameter. And Yeah.
Can you enter each of those blocks?
Well, there are sort of access panels that allow you to
Okay.
access.
So
Yes.
it's all a closed system except for maintenance, yes?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
It would actually be a very high security system because people are very sensitive about their data.
Of course. Facebook notwithstanding, right?
Yeah.
Good. So where is this? You said it's inside a mountain.
Yes, this will be inside a mountain in Norway.
Remarkable. Remarkable. And has this been implemented?
Not yet. No, our client is still negotiating, and we're actually looking at some other locations for him. Believe it or not, there are quite a few mountains around the world with quite big holes in them.
Wow.
There's one in Switzerland that actually has a whole airfield inside it. You can take off a small plane from inside the mountain. It would be a bit hair-raising to try and land.
I would imagine. Oh my heavens.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me just see. I have a few questions here. With the evolution of cities, how do you imagine our future? And what kind of timeline, if you have any idea in your vision for a transformation to a truly regenerative kind of environment?
It's really difficult to predict. And just at the moment, yeah, I feel as though things could be about to change really quite dramatically. In the UK, there's been some really big protests recently. So school kids and the Extinction Rebellion protests, which also coincided with a very dramatic film, documentary by David Attenborough. And just in 3 weeks, the whole tone of the debate has changed. And what would have seemed politically impossible 3 weeks ago now seems inevitable.
Wow.
Just a matter of how quickly we can do it.
In what specific ways? What kinds of things?
Well, yeah, in terms of how we decarbonize our economy, how we shift entirely away from fossil fuels. And there was a report that came out last week by the Committee on Climate Change, which was a governmental body set up. And that concluded that we could completely decarbonize our economy at negligible additional cost by 2050. And actually, it was extremely cautious in terms of what sort of changes it could be achieved, what changes of behavior. And lots of people are saying now that report is already out of date, because we've seen just from the last few weeks of protests that people are willing to discuss all sorts of things that were previously thought to be off limits, like the idea of flying less, like the idea of changing your diet so you consume a lot less meat. And for me, a really important one is thinking about cities and thinking about the kind of life we want to create in cities. And I think if you were to get a group of people together and ask them, without mentioning anything about climate change or the environment to start with, and ask them what their ideal way to live would be, I think most people would say they want to live with clean air, healthy food. They want to be close to communities. They want to be surrounded by friends and other sort of like-minded people, and live in cohesive communities and have good, efficient transports that can get you to and from work, and live in substantially walkable neighborhoods so that your journey to and from work could actually be the most enjoyable part of the day. Now, all of those things for me would constitute a huge improvement in people's quality of life. And those are actually the same changes that we need to make to bring about a zero carbon economy. So it doesn't have to be all about sacrifice at all. I think we could use this opportunity to completely rethink the way we live and improve our quality of life.
Yes. Yes. One of the things around regenerative design that touched me in another conversation I've had with people on the summit is the redesigning the notion of what a home is, rather than us supporting the home by paying utilities and paying our water bills and paying for every aspect to heat and cool the home, that it should be able to do that for us. This is our Earthship people, the East Coast Earth Homes, but I love that idea of a shift of paradigm, in that we're creating environments that sustain us rather than boxes we have to figure out how to sustain. And if we can migrate businesses into that kind of thinking, economically, politically, and logistically in their built environments, that would be a profound transformation.
Yeah.
So one of the things that really is prime in our conversation throughout the summit is the shift of mindset that has to occur. And you're really referring to that in the UK, that you're seeing a sea change in the way that people are relating to our current crisis. What insights, advice, suggestions would you have for folks that are looking at new opportunity for change and direction towards sustainability and regenerative design? What kinds of paradigm shifts could you help us become aware of?
Well, I think one of those that is specific to the shift from sustainable to regenerative is to think less in a sort of purely anthropocentric way and more in a holistic way. You know, we need to think of ourselves as part of a broader life support system, and we can't live independently of that. And so we better get much better at looking after that and thinking really carefully about how we fit into a broader web of life. And ultimately where that leads to is the idea of humans co-evolving with nature. I think another really important shift in our thinking is from short-term ways of thinking to much longer-term ways of thinking. You know, if you're prepared to contemplate a 5, 10, or 20-year payback periods, then there are all sorts of things that actually make much more economic sense, as well as being much better for the living world. And far too often, we think in very short-term timescales. And you know, that's been one of the real problems of the sort of neoliberal approach to capitalism, that it externalizes anything that is inconvenient or hard to measure. And that ends up as long-term loss to all of us. And the younger generations are not going to stand for it much longer.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, we can take a lesson from indigenous peoples in that regard, the 7th generation concept, where you think of the impact of everything that you do 7 generations forward and how it's going to impact the future. And that's not been a part of Western culture traditionally at all. Yeah.
Can you remind me of that at the end, because I want to write that down.
Sure.
And I think another really important shift is from pessimism or optimism to possibilism. And
I love that.
Viral agency. So possibilism, I think it was coined by Hans Rosling as a term. I may not be absolutely right there, but you know, the idea is that pessimism and optimism imply a certain kind of inevitability about the future, and you either feel hopeful or despondent about that. But actually, it's entirely down to our agency, and we need to work out what kind of future we want, what kind of future is possible, and then set about creating it. And you know, too often, and I'm thinking particularly of architects, but actually it applies to people more generally, we seem to have a tendency to minimize our agency. You know, we sort of think, well, you know, who am I to take a stand and you know, speak out on this and so on, and actually I have very limited power and so on. And we need to flip that around. And
I agree.
Actually I can do this, this, and this, and I'm going to damn well get on with it. And by doing that, I'm going to encourage other people to do the same. And that's what I mean by viral agency. And the shifts that I've talked about, they're actually part of a new book that I'm working on, which I'm co-authoring with someone called Sarah Ichioka. And the working title is 8 Paradigms Beyond Sustainability. And it's going to be arguing that we need to contemplate these 8 big changes of mindset if we're ready to flourish as a global human civilization.
I love it. And you're speaking to the theme of the summit, is that we all make a difference and we all have a voice and we all have agency. So that was beautiful, a perfect circle.
I guess you know Marianne Williamson's quote? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please say it if you know it.
Well, I don't know if I know it off by heart, but it's along the lines of what I was talking about. You know, who am I to be brilliant, talented, gorgeous? Well, who are you not to be? You're shrinking and thinking small does not serve the world. And actually, by taking action and demonstrating your agency, you can encourage others to do the same.
Exactly.
Much more eloquently than that.
No, you did great. You did great. You got it. And what I have, my call is Together We Rise. And each of us empowers another to empower another to make a difference altogether.
Nice.
Yeah. So, Michael, is there anything else that we could say in conclusion?
We could say a little bit about that table that you've got.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I just want to say, Michael has generously included in the summit package, for those of you that decide to purchase it, a spectacular model for a 3D table. And let's just take a look at that. And Michael, you can tell us about how this came about.
This is a full-scale one. The one that I'm offering for sale is a small model of this.
At a radical discount, by the way. And it's exclusive.
Absolutely.
And it's exclusively available to people that are getting the summit package. So
that's correct. Yeah, we've never offered it to anyone else. So what we have here is a design for a table that is based on 2 ideas from biology. The surface of the table, we divided that up into that ribbed structure based on the structure of a giant Amazon water lily leaf. And then most of what you see below the table surface, that is developed using a computer program called SKO, which is based on the growth patterns of bones and trees. And in principle, what this is trying to do is to get as close as possible to a theoretically perfect structure that uses an absolute minimum of materials and puts the materials in exactly the right place. And the raw material here is derived from potato starch. So it's a biologically derived material, and it's, as you can see, it's assembled in a biologically inspired way. And this is something that I think we're going to need to do more and more of. We're going to need to find ways of making materials from atmospheric carbon and then using ideas from biology to put them together in the most efficient and, I think, beautiful ways. That achieves a really substantial saving in resources compared to a more conventional table approach. And I think it's got a real sort of legibility and a biological beauty to it, personally.
It certainly does. And I just have to ask, this was 3D printed?
Yes, and 3D printing is a huge asset for people into biomimicry, because the way that structures work in biology is that often you have really quite complex structures that achieve their resource efficiency by putting the material exactly where it needs to be. Conventionally, with conventional ways of making things, that was always more expensive because complexity kind of automatically equaled more cost. With 3D printing, it can save money because you can actually achieve significant material saving by putting things together in the most efficient way. So 3D printing it allows us to get much closer to the way that things work in biology.
I want to ask you, where do you find a 3D printer facility to print things to scale and to actual real life size? I'm not aware of those kinds of places.
The large ones, they're a little harder to find. I mean, the scale model that we're offering, that's about the right size to print at a high street 3D printers, but it tends to be quite big companies or university departments, or sometimes one or two startups that have the bigger 3D printers. So that one that you saw there, that was printed on a 3D printer with a 3-foot cube printing bed. And that was just a small startup. So he did that for us.
And you said it was done with potato starch?
Yeah, it's called PLA, polylactic acid, derived from potato starch.
And that's a durable material. It doesn't melt or.
It would melt under high temperatures. Medium temperatures. I think it's got a melting point of about 60 or 70 degrees C. And then, if you were to bury that, it would eventually decompose. So, I think that's what you want, actually. It's not going to significantly deteriorate just in an indoor environment.
Wonderful. Anything else that we would want to wrap up with? What do you think?
Maybe as a parting note, I think what we really need to remember is that we're all going to have to do something and change the way we work. I mean, there is a role for government, but I think there's also a really important role for leaders of communities and businesses to work together and implement some of these. We're in a strange situation in that we have all the solutions we need to tackle the big challenges affecting humanity, but at the moment the progress is woefully inadequate. It's nowhere near the pace of change we need, and that's because I think we're all playing it too safe, and too often we're waiting for other people to make the changes first, and we can't do that. If we carry on like that, we will lose the respect of our children.
Well said. Magnificent. Thank you so much. Michael, thank you so much for being with us. And,
thank you, Mary.
And for your vision. And it's been really a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Keep the momentum going by checking out all the other experts. Every one of them has invaluable information that you can't afford to miss. Buy the Premium Summit package now. Join the global conversation in our Facebook group and take action in your home, community, or the world at large. Together, we will shape a world that works.